Father Harrison speaking.
Hi, Father Harrison. I was wondering, are you aware that Benedict XVI rejects Vatican Council I?
Excuse me, who am I speaking to?
My name is Brother Peter.
Brother Peter who?
Brother Peter Diamond.
Brother Peter Diamond?
Yes.
Well, it's a long time since we've been in touch.
Yes, I don't think I've ever spoken to you over the telephone. I know we traded some letters many years ago. But what I was interested in asking you about is, you're probably familiar with some of Benedict XVI's statements and actions vis-a-vis the quote Orthodox. And what I wanted to ask you was, wouldn't you agree that his position on the quote Orthodox constitutes a rejection of Vatican I?
What position are you talking about specifically with regard to the Orthodox?
The position that is taught in Vatican II and also taught in Dominus Jesus, and also confirmed by Benedict XVI in his books, etc., that the quote Orthodox churches are true particular churches, and thus that people who reject the papal primacy are inside the church, and that therefore you don't have to believe in the papacy to be in the church.
Well, I don't think that's an exact description of the word. I mean, the thing is, I've written somewhere else. I forget where now, but I've maybe in the Remnant some years ago. You can. I've got it somewhere. I can maybe dig it out and mail it to you or something. I haven't got time to talk now. I'm afraid I'm very busy. But I would argue that the idea of true particular churches, that doesn't mean to say that Eastern Orthodoxy as a sort of an entire denomination is the true. There's only one true church, and that's what I understand Benedict XVI and Vatican II also teach. I know you have a different view.
Well, he has said that they're, quote, pastors and bishops are, quote, pastors in the Church of Christ.
Okay, well, pastors, I mean, that's a kind of a, you can use these words in a general sense, a broad sense, and in a true particular church can mean, okay, that they're true in the sense that they have all the sacraments and that they have a particular church, as you know, just means a diocese run by a particular bishop in apostolic succession.
Well, in the Code of Canon Law,
they have all the true sacraments, and that doesn't mean to say that they're true in the sense of that they're correct and right in everything they say. But
here's the point, that he's saying that the bishops of a schismatic and heretical church are inside the church. That's contrary to Vatican I. And to say that they're
saying that there's inside and outside.
He says that they're.
I don't know whether he uses that.
His exact words are pastors in the Church of Christ, and you say that it's referring to these particular churches in the sense of a diocese. I would agree, because that's how even the new Code of Canon Law defines the term particular church. But that just makes the point that I'm trying to communicate, which is that it's contrary to Catholic teaching to say that a local church, which is led by a bishop who is a heretic who rejects the papacy, is a true local church inside the Church of Christ.
Well, I think that's debatable, and I think it's a complicated issue. I can't discuss this. I'll try and find out something I've written on this, and I might mail it to you. But I'm sorry, I haven't got time to discuss it on the phone. It's a complicated issue, and I can't really get into it now. Okay.
Would you be interested in a telephone discussion or debate about that?
I prefer to do. I don't see much point in telephone. I prefer to do things in writing. You can take much more care to say exactly what you mean and so on in that context. But I'm not particularly interested in oral debates and phone hookups or anything like that. No, I've got too much else to.
So just one question: would you say that the bishop, for example, with whom Benedict XVI made this common declaration of faith, the Eastern Orthodox bishop, is that bishop inside the Church of Christ, as Benedict XVI said?
I don't think he's inside the Church of Christ. I would say that he's in a situation kind of on the borderline. I've got an article coming out shortly in our publication Living Tradition, in which I'm arguing against the whole idea that everyone is either inside or outside the church. I'm saying that there's a situation of being sort of on the borderline, or anyway, so I don't accept this dichotomy of everyone is either inside or outside. I think that's an oversimplification of authentic ecclesiology, and I'm arguing right back from the Council of Florence on this as well, the whole situation of catechumens. Anyway, listen, I'm sorry I haven't got time to discuss it further now. I will try to find something I've written about that, and I might mail it to you, okay?
This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. You just heard my conversation with, quote, Father Brian Harrison. For those who do not know, Harrison is someone who became prominent in, quote, traditionalist circles of the Vatican II sect because he wrote an article in which he argued that the Church teaches that a heretic can be elected pope. And many non-sedevacantists considered Harrison's argument to be a smashing refutation of the sedevacantist position, when the truth is that his argument was completely false and thoroughly refuted in an article we published years ago, as well as in our book and in our Answers to Objections section. But for some time, Harrison has been considered by many to be a formidable defender of the legitimacy of the Vatican II antipopes, in large part because he's a professor at a pontifical university of the Vatican II sect. He frequently makes reference to Latin, and that causes people to conclude that he really understands the Catholic faith, when the fact of the matter is that he doesn't understand or believe in the Catholic faith at all. And that's why he will not engage in a debate on the issue of Benedict XVI's validity or the particular matter of the indefensible heresy that is taught by Benedict XVI and Vatican II on the, quote, Orthodox. In the conversation which you just heard, Harrison begins by saying that he does not think that what I was saying is an exact representation of the post-Vatican II position on the, quote, Orthodox. Now, it is an accurate representation of their position. Benedict XVI explicitly states in his book Light of the World that being in union with the Pope or the papacy is not constitutive for the particular church. In other words, he emphasizes that in order to be a true particular church, you do not have to accept the papal primacy. You can, in fact, reject it. And we have to understand the significance of what we're talking about. We're talking about the very foundation of the church, what Christ instituted in St. Peter, the truth that where Peter is, there is the church, the truth that was defined by Pope Boniface VIII in Unum Sanctum. All of these things are completely denied by the position of Benedict XVI and Vatican II on the, quote, Orthodox. And it's additionally significant because it cuts right to the matter of whose position is faithful to Vatican I and the papal primacy. And when you understand the implications of this teaching of Dominus Jesus, etc., that the, quote, Orthodox churches are true particular churches, you can see why the heretics who defend Benedict XVI will run from addressing this heresy like a devil runs from holy water. So Benedict XVI says in his book Light of the World that it's the teaching of Vatican II and Dominus Jesus, and that this teaching is binding, that the, quote, Orthodox are true particular churches, even though they do not accept Catholic doctrine on the papacy. That is the opposite of Catholic dogma. He says on page 89 of his book, quote, what I defended was the heritage of the Second Vatican Council and of the entire history of the Church. The passage, referring to Dominus Jesus, means that the Eastern churches, and he's referring to the, quote, Orthodox, are genuine particular churches, although they are not in communion with the Pope. In this sense, unity with the Pope is not constitutive for the particular church, end quote. And as I mentioned in the conversation, a particular church means a true local segment of the universal church.
Dominus Jesus explicitly teaches the same heresy on particular churches in number 17 of that document. It says that these churches are true particular churches even though they lack full communion with the Catholic Church, since they do not accept the Catholic doctrine of the primacy. Therefore, their position explicitly stated is that churches which reject the primacy are inside the Church. And as I made a brief reference to in the conversation with Harrison, Benedict XVI has said the same thing in common declarations with schismatics. And I could have interrupted Harrison and gotten into more of the papal teaching which his position completely rejects, but he probably would have just hung up the phone on me. So you have to let these heretics go on and spread their nonsense in the conversation, otherwise they'd just hang up on you. And so what we have here is a totally indefensible heresy on the part of Benedict XVI, on the part of Dominus Jesus, and on the part of Vatican II. All of this is taught in Vatican II. And it's exactly the opposite of so many papal pronouncements, that individuals who depart from the unity of Peter, who reject the papal primacy, they are outside the body. And I could go through quote after quote after quote. If Harrison had been willing to debate me, which obviously he's not, or had been willing to even stay on the phone, and I believe he could have if he wanted to, then we could have gotten into those papal pronouncements, which would have shown that his position is a complete lie. It's interesting that when I quickly explained to him how this position that the, quote, Orthodox are true particular churches contradicts Vatican I, and it does, Harrison responds by saying that he must refer to something he has written. That's because, of course, he cannot explain it in a simple conversation. It's much easier for heretics to lie in writing, and that's all they're doing. They're lying. They're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. It's harder to do that in a simple conversation, especially with someone who is familiar with the issue, and he can put you on the spot. Now, if you're dealing with sincere and spiritually attentive readers who are honest, heretics should not be able to get away with lying in writing. But the truth is that most of the people who are in the, quote, traditional movement, unfortunately are not sincere, they're not attentive, and they're not honest. And therefore, if a heretic will begin to lie using a multiplicity of words, contradicting in later paragraphs what he said in previous paragraphs, and if he does it in a subtle fashion, most people will not pick up the contradiction, and they will not hold that writer accountable for failing to directly address the core questions and issues. Some good-willed readers will, but the vast majority of the individuals will not spot the problem unless someone is right there to point it out for them. That's why these oral debates can sometimes more effectively show the heresy that's being promoted for the people who are frankly in a spiritual fog. But if you're dealing, as I said, with sincere individuals, a written response can be just as devastating. We've done many of those. For example, I recently wrote an article called John Salza Has No Idea What He's Talking About, in which I absolutely devastate every page of an article that another non-sedevacantist wrote, showing just massive contradiction after massive contradiction, changes of position on core issues from article to article, lie after lie being spread on so many pages, false argument after false argument. And a written work of that nature can obviously be very effective for people who have the interest level to carefully follow the points and the honesty to sincerely consider what has been written. But that's not the vast majority of the people. And so that's why in an oral exchange like the one I had with Harrison, you can see that he can't even attempt to explain his position because he's lying. And so he has to run away and mail something off that's a bunch of gobbledygook. In that way, heretics are able to get away with never addressing the massive contradiction in their position, which is staring them right in the face. In this case, the massive contradiction with which he's faced is the fact that the Catholic Church dogmatically teaches that individuals who reject the papacy are outside the Church, while Benedict XVI, Vatican II, etc., officially teach that individuals who reject the papacy, namely the, quote, Orthodox, are inside the Church. And so the reason he cannot simply explain his position in a conversation is because he's lying. it's also interesting that he says that to refer to something as a true particular church does not mean that it is true in all aspects. It means that they have true sacraments. That's completely beside the point. Of course, their teaching, referring to Benedict XVI and Vatican II and Dominus Jesus, that the quote orthodox are true particular churches, does not mean that Benedict XVI or the Vatican thinks that the quote orthodox are true in everything that they believe or do. Dominus Jesus, in the very passage in which it states that the quote orthodox are true particular churches, explicitly states that, quote, they do not accept the Catholic doctrine of the primacy, end quote. Therefore, Benedict XVI's position is that even though the Orthodox have a false teaching on the primacy, they are still true particular churches, which means true local segments of the Church of Christ. Therefore, Harrison's statement is pointless. He then says that inside or outside, I don't know if Benedict XVI uses that term in reference to the quote orthodox. I proceeded to quote for him Benedict XVI's common declaration with Bartholomew, in which Benedict XVI uses the very words, in the Church of Christ, to say that the schismatic and heretical leader is in the Church. I then reference the new Code of Canon Law, Canon 368, which defines a particular church as a local church or a diocese of the universal church. Therefore, there is no doubt that when Vatican II, Dominus Jesus, and Benedict XVI teach that the schismatic quote orthodox are true particular churches, they are teaching that churches and bishops which reject Vatican I and the papacy are true local segments of the universal church. That is completely heretical, as we've covered. Harrison then says that it's a complicated issue, and that he'd have to send me something in writing. Again, it's always easier for them to lie in writing. Near the end of the conversation, I asked him the simple question concerning whether the heretical, quote, orthodox bishop, with whom Benedict XVI made his common declaration of faith, is inside the church. Harrison first says that he doesn't think the heretical bishop is inside the Church of Christ, contradicting Benedict XVI, Dominus Jesus, and Vatican II. And then he says that, quote, I would say that he's in a situation where he's kind of on the borderline, end quote. Kind of on the borderline? So they're not even on the borderline, they're kind of on the borderline. Well, that's actually heretical, because papal teaching is not that they're inside the church, it's not that they're on the borderline, it's that they're outside the church. Needless to say, Harrison's heretical response would not hold up at all in a debate. As Leo XIII says in Satis Cognitum, referring specifically to heretical bishops like this, he says, quote, if they deliberately secede from Peter and his successors, because by this secession they are separated from the foundation on which the whole edifice must rest, they are therefore outside the edifice itself, end quote. There are many other documents, as I said earlier, one could cite. In order to substantiate his novel and heretical idea that heretics are not outside the church and not inside the church, but kind of on the borderline, Harrison references an article that he has coming out, in which I guess he's going to attempt to prove that heretics are not inside or outside the church. Of course, he cannot explain it in a normal conversation or defend it in a debate, because then it would be more obvious that he is lying and that his position is nonsense. So, that's the response of a, quote, priest who is considered to be one of the most learned and formidable defenders of the, quote, papacy of the Vatican II anti-popes. He won't debate because he'd be completely refuted. He has absolutely no cogent answer for obvious heresies of Benedict XVI, and he winds up arguing that heretics aren't outside the church, and that individuals who reject the papacy are not outside the church, but that they're kind of on the borderline, in the face of dozens of magisterial pronouncements which explicitly teach that they are outside the church. This is the folly of the false traditionalists. This is the theological and spiritual bankruptcy of their heretical leaders and guides. This is the emptiness of their position, and this is the evil behind the movement to keep people inside the Vatican II sect. It should also be noted that Harrison defends all of the heresies of Vatican II. He vehemently argues that Vatican II's heretical teaching on religious liberty did not contradict traditional teaching at all, even though Benedict XVI has himself admitted that it contradicts traditional teaching. Harrison also holds that Muslims and Catholics together worship the one true God, for he knows that if they do not, the entire Vatican II foundation crumbles. Since that is indeed an official teaching of the Vatican II Church, he would be well served to listen to our recent debate on Vatican II and its teaching on Islam, in which, among other things, the Catholic teaching that Muslims are pagans and do not worship the one true God is covered.